Welcome to a special episode of Channel Legendarium. Today we'll be talking about the rise of the medieval fighting man, knights. We're going to look at how the collapse of Charlemagne's empire and the invention of the stirrup led to the rise of the knightly class. And then we're going to look at their arms and armor, their family and home life, and finally the tournament field, which made a perfectly acceptable substitute for the battlefield. The knights emerged because of the second great imperial collapse of the Dark Ages. One of the things that made the Dark Ages so dark was the fact that it saw not one but two great collapses. First, the Roman Empire in 476 AD, and then the collapse of Charlemagne's empire over 300 years later. Charlemagne, during his life, had come very close to rebuilding the Western Roman Empire. However, none of his grandsons were up to the job. They divided the empire three ways, started fighting among themselves, and because of their weak leadership, both local warlords were able to take control from the king, and also Viking raiders came in and started taking everything that wasn't nailed down. So Western Europe started to look very much like this painting. The local lords didn't just have to worry about bad neighbors crossing their borders and taking their stuff, they also had to worry about Viking raiders taking everything else, including the peasants. So they needed a new fighting force. During the early Middle Ages before, armies tended to fight on foot. However, the lords needed somebody fast and hard-hitting to combat both their neighbors and Viking raiders. And their solution was ultimately the horsemen. The reason why they could use horsemen was because of a wonderful new invention that found its way to Europe from Asia sometime during the reign of Charlemagne, the stirrup. With the stirrup, the horsemen became much more important. In very early medieval battlefields, horsemen were actually just well-off peasants who could afford horses. However, after the stirrup was invented, it became possible for riders to run their horses in a zigzag pattern to avoid enemy fire. They could go from a full gallop to stopping on a dime. They could even rear their horse up on its hind legs so the horse kicked with its front legs. Since the horsemen were now much more valuable, the lords came up with a way to show them just how appreciated they were. They lifted them up from the ranks of the peasantry and gave them the status of knights, or very minor nobles. Now, what kind of arms and armor did they use? You might notice in the bio tapestry that the knights are wearing what appear to be fish scales, though that is actually chainmail. Chainmail was the preferred armor of knights in the early Middle Ages. It could be made up from as many as 50,000 individually riveted ringlets. A full suit of chainmail would have weighed about 44 pounds, and it was so expensive that suits of chainmail would be handed down from father to son as a generational heirloom. There are stories about some chainmail suits serving families of knights for over 300 years, and indeed they were strong enough to turn aside a sword blow. On the battlefield, knights tended to prefer axes and lances, since an axe could chop its way through a chainmail tunic, and you could put a lance under your armpit while charging to put all of the force straight there on the tip. However, the sword carried special significance for the knight, because a sword was a present from the king which showed that you weren't a peasant anymore. That is one of the reasons why swords became so important to the knights. It's also worth noting that swords took over 2 months to make, were tremendously expensive. Like chainmail tunics, they were passed down from father to son, often given names, and represented the height of both technology and craftsmanship during the early Middle Ages. Thus, it's not surprising that most medieval legends center around swords. Take, for example, the Song of Roland, which is, appropriately enough, about Roland. When Roland realizes that he's about to be overwhelmed by his enemies, he takes his beautiful sword Darendel and hurls it into the side of a cliff, and it remained there for hundreds of years until an especially holy group of monks came by, removed it, and placed it in their monastery. There was even a legend about Charlemagne and his sword Joyeux. According to the legends, Joyeux could change colors 30 times in a single day and glowed brighter than a star whenever it was held in Charlemagne's hands. In addition, Joyeux was said to be made from the spear of Longinus, a weapon said to have pierced the side of Christ during his crucifixion. However, in the hands of anybody but Charlemagne, the sword would not glow, nor would it change colors. And finally, we have Excalibur, the weapon belonging to King Arthur, whose father, Uther Pendragon, had forced it into a stone before he died. When Arthur removed it at the age of 15, it showed him to be the one true king, and before he died, he had his most faithful knight throw the sword back into the lake so that nobody else would have it. So a couple of recurring themes with these medieval sword legends are, number one, the magical power and great beauty of the swords, along with the idea that nobody except the chosen hero can be allowed to wield it. One can't help but wonder if these legends show us just how jealous the knights were of both their swords and their newfound status as nobles. As I mentioned, knights were relative newcomers to the nobility during the time we're discussing. In fact, many of the established noble families considered them to be rank upstarts. They described them as men of dirt and people plucked from the gutter. However, the nobles did like remaining nobles, and to keep both the favor of the king and to try to get some of the fiefs that the knights were being granted for their service, they married their daughters into the new knightly class. Today we would probably describe these marriages as forced marriages, in which girls might be required to marry a knight who is 10, 15, or even 20 years older than her. And bear in mind, he's a professional killer, so life with him might not be especially pleasant. A wife's duty was basically to have children. Remember, this is a time when most babies did not survive to maturity, so a woman might have 10 children and only 3 or 4 would reach adulthood. So medieval wives tended to be pregnant more often than not. To house his growing brood, a medieval knight would build what was known as a motte and bailey. Of course, this would be restricted to the better-off knights. Basically, a motte and bailey was a ditch dug in a circle. They would then build a fence on the interior of the trench and then use all of the dirt they'd pulled up to build a mound called a scarp of packed earth. Inside the fence and the trench, you would have everything you would need. Sheep, pigs, goats, cows would be corralled there. You'd have servants' quarters, soldiers' barracks, workshops, smiths, anything and everything that you might need would be there. The center of social life in the fief would be the keep, built on top of the mound. These keeps were pretty rough places compared to what we think of when we often think of medieval halls. The floors would often be carpeted with a mix of chicken bones, urine, dogs' droppings, and sometimes rotten food. There would be huge fireplaces large enough to roast an oxen that often doubled as a toilet. And the minstrels wouldn't be singing fair stories about courtly love, they would be singing brutal medieval ballads about the likes of Roland and Charlemagne, how many of their enemies they killed, how far their brains got knocked from their skulls, and how many limbs were left on the battlefield. And on the subject of limbs being left on the battlefield, let's talk about tournaments. Once again, when we think of the Middle Ages, we often think of tournaments as being very grand and lavish affairs, with brave knights jousting to win their ladies' favor. But in the early Middle Ages, tournaments were basically free-for-alls. A party of knights would meet together, sometimes as few as 40, other times as many as 200. They would pair off into teams of equal numbers and then have at each other. They could roam wherever they wanted. The tournament field might cover whole villages and towns, with knights chasing each other around and chopping each other up. And I'm not kidding about the chopping each other up. Knights during tournaments could lose fingers, hands, arms, sometimes even their lives. The only way to save your life if you were overwhelmed during a tournament was to shout peace. And if you did that, you became the winner's prisoner. In order to get your freedom, your wife would have to pay a ransom in gold, and if you couldn't cough up the necessary gold, then you would lose your horse and your armor and anything else that the winner wanted to take. So what did the winners do with all of the money they won on the tourney field? Well, they didn't keep it for themselves. Number one, because they thought that saving money was for peasants, and they certainly did not see themselves as peasants. Secondly, it paid for knights to be generous, because if you spread the wealth around, giving, say, a helmet and a battle axe to the knight who served a great count, that knight could put in a good word for you with the count, and you would find yourself serving a noble lord and lady in their motte and bailey. Well, I hope that you enjoyed our talk about the knights of the early Middle Ages. We'll be putting out some more videos like this fairly soon. Please like, please subscribe. If you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. I would definitely like to hear, and I'll see you next time.